These men are members of the KGB working in North America. This man is an illegal, a spy trained in Moscow and sent to the United States. This man is a defector from Cuban intelligence, living in hiding under constant threat of death. This man ran operations against the West from Czechoslovakia. This man was trained by the most sinister department of the KGB and sent to North America. All of them received their orders from here, number 2 Dzerzhinsky Square in Moscow. This is the headquarters of the KGB. From here, the KGB continues to carry out the mandate given to the secret police by Lenin, who said it was to be the sword and shield of the revolution, the offense and defense of Soviet aims throughout the world. Lubyanka prison is the center of the vast KGB bureaucracy directly responsible to the Politburo for its operations against the West. Ever since Lenin took over the secret police of his defeated enemy, the Tsar, the Soviet espionage apparatus has mirrored the leadership under which it serves. Under Lenin, in the early days of revolutionary turmoil, it was known as the Cheka, and it imposed the Bolshevik rule upon the nation, setting up an international network of informers and tracking down and liquidating enemies of the new regime. Under Stalin, the name of the secret police was changed to GPU, and it became the most effective instrument of mass murder until the Second World War. Stalin used the GPU to eradicate millions of peasants in the Ukraine who protested the creation of collective farms from their lands. And during the mid-30s, Russia was racked by what became known as the Terror, the mass purges created by Stalin. Show trials became a function of the secret police activities, and more than 75% of the Soviet general staff of the army and senior ministries were arrested by the GPU, tried and executed. In 1953, Stalin died. It was appropriate that the small band of survivors at the top of the communist hierarchy quickly arrested one of their own, Lavrenti Beria, the ambitious and coldly ruthless head of the secret police, which by then had become known as the NKVD. It was Beria who had presided over the purges ordered by Stalin. He himself was executed. In 1955, Nikita Khrushchev took full power. The secret police became known as the KGB. Under Khrushchev and his successors, the KGB looked increasingly outward to espionage and intelligence activities in the rest of the world. In the past decade, it has become a vanguard element of Soviet expansion and activities throughout the Third World, Western Europe, and North America. The KGB has become a massive bureaucracy reporting directly to the Politburo, the select body that runs the Soviet Union. Its functions are tied to the International Department, which runs and finances both communist and non-communist organizations in other countries, and to the Ministry of Defense, with whom it shares espionage activities in other nations. The KGB is organized into chief directorates. From a separate headquarters in Moscow, the first chief directorate controls foreign espionage activities. The second chief directorate is the largest and most important. With a network of informers, it is responsible for ensuring internal security. The current head of the KGB is Yuri Andropov, a key member of the Politburo, a close colleague of Leonid Brezhnev, and one of the most powerful men in Russia. As head of the KGB, Andropov controls the most influential and sinister bureau of the Soviet bureaucracy, whose main purpose is the total control of the Soviet people. For North America, the activities of the first chief directorate are divided into departments which carry out a wide range of activities from Soviet establishments located across the continent. Since 1933, this building has served as a Soviet embassy in Washington. It is a major center of espionage activity in the United States. This is Alexander Kluyev, listed as an attaché at the embassy. He is a KGB officer. This is Boris Ivanov, a correspondent with the Soviet news service TASS. He is also a KGB officer. During a recent hearing of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, the principal witness was Harold Brown, who at that time was Secretary of Defense. Subject, U.S. military posture and the defense budget for 1980. Present were Soviet TV reporter Yuri Soltan and his cameraman Anatoly Ivanov, as well as Milos Tulva, a correspondent for Izvestia. Seen here is Dr. Mikhail Milstein, who is now with the Soviet Academy of Science, specializing in military affairs. Next to Milstein, Yuri Kapralov, first secretary of the Soviet embassy. Then there was a man who identified himself as Andrei Krutsky. The Soviet embassy lists him as an attaché, and this man, Viktor Tyutin, official title, third secretary at the embassy. American intelligence sources identify both Krutsky and Tyutin as being officers of the KGB. In North America, there are dozens of Soviet establishments, everything from diplomatic missions to trade offices and businesses that sell tractors or operate merchant shipping. Since 1970, the number of Soviet officials in North America has increased dramatically. Until 1980, Richard Kinsey was deputy chief of the Soviet desk in the FBI. His duties were to closely monitor the activities of the Soviets in the U.S.
The numbers have doubled in the last 10 years, from 1970 to when I left in early 1980. The Soviet presence had almost doubled. There was a time when I first was in the work where we could almost go one agent on one identified or suspected Soviet intelligence officer. When I left, quite the contrary was true, and we were vastly outnumbered, where our agents were trying to cover 3 or 4 known or suspected intelligence officers.
One of the basic requirements for Soviet diplomats is to file travel plans whenever they travel in the U.S. or Canada. It is a restriction that in the Soviet Union is strictly applied to Western diplomats. But for the Soviets in North America, the theory and the practice seldom meet.
We find through our coverage of them that they often deviate from those travel plans, and surprisingly enough will end up traveling via the SAC base in Omaha, Nebraska, when their travel plans call for them to go through Kansas or some other route. And that's a violation of travel regulations. If we bring it to the attention of the State Department, then a strong note of protest is made to the Soviet ambassador.
Is there anything ever done about these strong notes of protest?
They're filed.
The Soviet embassy in Washington is also distinctive for another type of spying operation. On the roof is a large antenna that appears harmless, but is used to electronically eavesdrop on telephone conversations in the Washington area. 1/3 of all local calls and most long-distance calls are transmitted by microwave, which can be plucked from the air by these Soviet antennae. Literally millions of calls are recorded and put through computers, which are programmed to listen for certain key words or are activated by the phone numbers of people who are of interest to the Soviets. In 1972, while negotiating a purchase of surplus grain from the United States, the Soviet embassy used its telephone intercept capability to eavesdrop on conversations between the U.S. Department of Agriculture and grain dealers in the Midwest. Because the Soviets were able to acquire inside information about the U.S. bargaining position, they were able to outmaneuver the U.S. negotiators and sign a long-term contract for a record amount of grain at very low prices. Crop failures the next year in the U.S. drove consumer prices upwards, but the Soviets were able to continue buying grain at the low prices they had negotiated the previous year. In San Francisco, the Soviet consulate houses sophisticated electronic equipment and occupies a commanding position overlooking San Francisco Bay.
Our investigations determined that many of those antennae were in such a position that they had the capability of doing microwave intercept in Silicon Valley.
About an hour's drive south of San Francisco is the area that has come to be known as Silicon Valley. It is perhaps the most highly concentrated area of modern technology and research in the United States. Its products include microcomputers, silicon chips, and fiber optics, all vital component parts of military hardware. The San Francisco consulate has also provided the Soviets with an easy access to U.S. military establishments on the West Coast. For example, by observing the Polaris submarines being refitted in clear view of a nearby seafood restaurant frequented by the Soviets, the numbers of American submarines then at sea can be determined. In the Canadian capital, the Soviet embassy is also equipped with antennae. However, the most visible microwave intercept equipment is not on the Soviet roof, but nearby on the roof of the Polish embassy. It is the Eastern Bloc nations, the Poles, the Czechs, and the East Germans that play an important part in the game of espionage. William Kelly is the former head of the RCMP Security Service.
Intelligence services of bloc countries allegedly work independently of each other. But that isn't true. They work very closely with each other and under the dominance of the Russian KGB. There was a time when it was felt that the KGB were too well known around external affairs, and they didn't think that the reception they'd receive would be the best. So they wanted to naturally recruit or penetrate, and they decided that the Hungarians could do the job under the circumstances better than they could.
Developing countries make.
Vladislav Bittman was a deputy director of Czech intelligence at the time he fled to the West.
Because there are many people who are afraid to get in touch, to be associated with a Soviet diplomat, for example, who is an intelligence officer and uses the diplomatic cover in most cases. But they don't hesitate to develop a very friendly contact with a Czech diplomat or a Polish diplomat or an East German diplomat, because they think what the representatives of these small countries can do. And they don't realize that they do basically the same job, only under a different color, but...
How closely allied were you with the Soviet intelligence, say?
They know everything that the Czechoslovak or any other satellite service does.
On the east coast of America, on Long Island, is another Soviet diplomatic residence. It is an estate near the town of Glen Cove, which serves as a weekend and summer retreat for Soviet officials of the nearby United Nations. Soviet citizen Arkady Shevchenko often stayed there while he was the Undersecretary General of the UN.
And all the top floors of the building are full of the sophisticated equipment for to intercept all the conversation, telephone conversation, or anything which is going on around the area. At least 15 or 17 technicians who are working there to do all this job.
The estate at Glen Cove and the electronic monitoring equipment jammed into it also represent an interesting geographic choice by the Soviets.
I might point out that the estate, while it's located somewhat north of the establishment, is very close to Grumman Aircraft Factory, which is one of the United States' main builders of sophisticated warplanes. And it's sort of midway between the main plant and a testing facility that Grumman has further out on the island. And those antennae are pointed toward both facilities.
The newest Soviet residence in New York is a building in the Riverdale section of the Bronx. They got permission to build on one of the highest sites in New York City. Situated at an elevation that permits interception of phone messages over the widest possible area. Yet back in Washington, the Soviets were not pleased with the location of their embassy, so they asked for and again were granted permission to build on another site, at the corner of Belmont and Wisconsin Avenue. It is one of the highest locations in Washington.
Because it's so high here, we'd like to get a good shot of Washington. Can we get in?
It's forbidden. If you want to take picture, you must go to our embassy and decide this matter with our chief.
In Washington, they will have everything. They can, listen all the conversation which are going on from White House to any departments or Pentagon.
You have a good view from here anyway.
Yeah, I think so. Just on the roof of the building.
On the roof? Yeah, I'll bet.
Much of the construction on the Soviet embassy complex is already completed. The new residences have been built complete with antennae on the roof. In Moscow, the Americans had requested permission to build a new embassy to replace their old and overcrowded facilities there. In this instance, comparisons are useful. The United States was eventually offered and accepted a site on one of the lowest points of land in the city, and after years of bureaucratic wrangling, permission was only recently granted to begin construction. In the United States, there is one place that is more important for the KGB than even the embassy or its consulates.
How important is the United Nations to the Soviets in terms of espionage?
It's a nest of spies.
The KGB operations in the UN are controlled by the First Department of the First Chief Directorate of the KGB. This department directs all operations against the United States and Canada. The officers of the department operate from the embassies and consulates. Operations are also run from the UN itself, where over 500 Soviets work. The UN was formed to provide a forum for dialogue between the nations of the world. Each country sends its ambassadors and their staffs to the debates which occur in the General Assembly and Security Council. Awarded diplomatic status, their representatives live in the equivalent of embassies in New York City and are expected to represent their country's interests. But in the Secretariat building are the international civil servants without diplomatic status. They are expected to be rigorously non-partisan in their administration of the UN's various departments and worldwide programs. In 1978, one of the most important Soviet defections to the West occurred. Arkady Shevchenko, who was the Under-Secretary General of the United Nations, stunned his Soviet colleagues. As the highest-ranking Soviet in the UN Secretariat, Shevchenko had knowledge of extensive Soviet espionage activities in the United States. So serious was the defection that two of the Soviet Union's highest-ranking ambassadors, Dobrynin and Trianovsky, demanded a meeting with Shevchenko and his U.S. lawyer. This is the first broadcast of a tape recorded at that meeting. Ambassador Dobrynin reveals that Shevchenko was privy to Soviet state secrets, even though he was supposedly an impartial UN civil servant.
That he read top secret documents in his mission. Up till the last day when he left, it showed that there was no surveillance.
He gave me copies of this letter. He refers to what he read, a betrayal of the ideals of the October Revolution, which is taking place now in the USSR, the monstrous abuses carried on by the KGB, compel me to take the decision to renounce my membership in the CPSU, etc.
That naturally leads one to think that he's in some abnormal state, because a normal person or one acting at his free will cannot make these explanations.
There was no need for him to stay in the Foreign Service for 30 years or 20 years, and then finally find out that he disagrees with the fruit of the October Revolution.
The United Nations Secretariat gives so many advantages for the KGB to penetrate actually almost all aspects of the American life, because they, unlike diplomats, go and travel across the country freely. They even should not, under no obligation, to notify the State Department or the American mission about their travel trips or participation anywhere.
Probably the most active intelligence gathering functions are carried out by Soviets assigned to the United Nations. I say that for a number of reasons, primarily that UN employees also have total freedom of movement throughout the United States.
It's a golden mine for the Soviet Union. It's so easy to have such a huge number of the people involved in intelligence activity. My estimate would be that the people who are working for the Soviet intelligence in general in New York, about 300 or 350 persons engaged in all these activities.
In theory, the employees are there to carry out the ideals and humanitarian causes of the United Nations and run the bureaucratic machinery. But Shevchenko quickly discovered that even though he was one of the United Nations' highest-ranking bureaucrats and the head of his department, the orders came from the KGB.
I had in my department 13 Soviets, and at least 7 of them were professional KGB officers, because they didn't do anything. They didn't work in my department. They didn't receive orders from me as the head of the department. They received the orders from their bosses in the mission, from the KGB residence.
This man was one of those Soviets working for Shevchenko. His name is Valdek Enger. He was placed in Shevchenko's department not by the normal UN hiring practices, but by the KGB resident or senior officer in New York City who requested Shevchenko's help in placing the spy in the United Nations.
I agreed with that, but I think it was a mistake because it was very difficult to get rid of him later. Because he transformed my office into a kind of a center of gathering all these KGB guys and collecting all these materials and all the things. And he didn't do anything at all. Whenever I asked him to do something for the department or for the secretariat or to write something for me, he was always reluctant or absent. Or have this bunch of his KGB guys in my office. I was mad about this situation.
Here, Enger is asking a U.S. naval commander to pass on secret documents.
Yes, Jim?
Oh, yes.
Fine, thanks.
Do you have the stuff?
Yes, I do.
You do. Okay, yes. Now, you know what? Proceed now to the south. And just after the Essex Toll Plaza,
Yeah?
you'll see the phone booth. Public phone booth.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the second phone booth from the right, if you look at in front of you, after the booth. Just under the shelf, you'll see the small box, okay?
Okay.
And follow the instructions completely, and you'll find everything there, all right?
Okay.
Okay.
Right, I'll talk to you later.
Okay,
Right.
bye-bye.
The head of the KGB operating out of the Soviet mission to the United Nations has been identified by Shevchenko as V. Kazakov. Within the UN, the Soviets are also able to exert influence. Viktor Lesyovsky is a KGB officer who occupies the post of Special Assistant to the Secretary General in the United Nations. He chooses the speakers for the debates in the General Assembly. Vasily Solodonnikov is another KGB officer who served as a senior secretariat official. A man who served with Solodonnikov at the International Relations Institute in Moscow was Igor Glagolev, who was an advisor to the Politburo before he defected to the West.
They were high-ranking members of the KGB. They were not, people who were used by the KGB, because KGB can use, many people without their knowledge. They were just regular agents of the KGB, and the trouble is that they control the staff of the United Nations permanently, always.
Solodonnikov was an advisor to Joshua Nkomo and other rebel leaders during the war in Zimbabwe-Rhodesia. He is now a key formulator of Soviet policy in Africa and is their ambassador to Zambia.
Later on, she was assistant to the Secretary General, and later on she was director of the Institute of Africa. And now she's the Soviet ambassador in Zambia, where he masterminded the takeover of Zimbabwe, and now he's organizing the takeover of South Africa.
Noel Field joined the State Department as a Foreign Service officer in 1926. During the 1930s, he became a Soviet agent. Lawrence Duggan was head of the Latin American desk of the State Department and was a political advisor to the Secretary of State. He, too, was a Soviet agent. Both Duggan and Field were brought into a Soviet espionage ring by the same recruiter, a woman of amazing persuasiveness.
I got them Noel Field. And I got them Larry Duggan. And I got them all, sort of Gesocks, small fry, like Brian, and, technical personnel, several women that were mail drops, and so on and so forth. And it was always done, for example, with women, it was mostly done with sex. I would always send somebody who was handsome, and they generally went to bed with whatever it was, and it worked.
During the 1930s, Haida Massing was Soviet espionage's most effective recruiting agent in America. This is her only television interview, filmed shortly before her death in 1981. During the 1920s, she married into the Communist Party in Europe, falling in love with its intrigue and fellowship. Her first husband was Gerhard Eisler, a top official of the Communist international espionage arm, the Comintern.
When you were 17 and you joined the Communist Party, or became a member of that circle, was it an emotional rather than a political conversion?
Only emotional, not political at all. Didn't understand a thing about politics. As I said, I would have understood this one sentence. It is a theory, an ideology, which has as its aim a better life for all. Well, that was good enough for me, better life for all. I'm amongst all. But that was as political as it was. Otherwise, it was emotional. I married into the party.
But for somebody who didn't understand it, you became one of their most effective operators.
Later, much, much, much later. Much later, when I understood much more, and when really my effectiveness is so closely married, connected to fascism. I was effective because there was fascism, and fascism had to be fought. It took me a long time, and I didn't want to realize it, that actually I was not fighting fascism. It was all baloney. The Russians used me. But to admit that to yourself is, of course, very degrading, self-degrading. You hesitate very much to do that. So for a long time, I pretended that I believed that this is the way to fight fascism, and I acted it out.
Okay, well, let's go into some of the areas where you were very successful. You came over to America in the early 1930s. What did you do, and how did you get into that circle where you could operate effectively?
Well, first of all, when I came, I knew people. You see, I knew people. I'd met people in Moscow. I'd met many Americans in Moscow. I was a functionary. For example, I was called on by the Comintern to entertain important Americans when they came to Moscow. So I had connections, personal connections.
The connections were with those in the American government. So Haida Massing, closely controlled by the Russians, working in New York City, and armed with a sharp wit and a fierce determination, went on to recruit Lawrence Duggan, one of the senior members of the U.S. State Department.
You know, the thing that is so interesting is it wasn't difficult. I called him, because he was a friend of Noel Field, and said that I wanted to see him. And I went into the State Department, into his room, and we made an appointment. And I approached him directly, hard. Larry, I said, I needn't tell you about fascism. You know it all. You know it better than I, because you see all the material I don't see. We want your help. Will you help us? And he said, yes. I have certain conditions, but yes, I will help you. Now, I will give you all the material that I think might be of interest to you and the Russians. He knew immediately who I was. He was nobody's fool. And only I will not give you the material per se. I will dictate it to somebody, and the somebody has to be English speaking and a very good shorthand. There it was. I couldn't believe it.
While recruiting Noel Field, Ada Massing uncovered another Soviet spy ring in Washington, of which she had been unaware.
I had worked on Noel Field for a long time. I had listened to Wagner, which I hate. I had read Freud, which I dislike, and discussed fine points of Freud with him, really lying in my teeth. And because I wanted him, I wanted to do a good job. And I also liked the family. I liked her better than him. He was a little bit, although he was rather good looking, very tall and very sort of gentlemanlike, to me he was a little bit unappetizing. It must have been a body smell. I don't know what it was, but anyhow, I liked her better. She was also more honest. She was a little dumb. And one day, I said, Noel, it's about time that you have more or less agreed that you will work with me. Now I think we ought to start. And he said, Heda, I wanted to tell you this, and I hesitated because I know it will upset you, but I have decided that I will not work with you, but I would rather work with somebody who does exactly the same thing you do, who is, however, with me in the same department. And it would be so much easier technically to convey whatever I have to give to this person. And I said, who is this person? Of course, terrified. Here was my investment of 1 year studying Wagner and Freud for that. Anyhow, I said, who is this man? And he said, I don't think you know him. His name is Alger Hiss.
He was an advisor to President Roosevelt at the crucial Yalta Conference, and was the man who flew to Washington with the historic charter documents of the United Nations Organizing Conference in San Francisco, where he had served as temporary Secretary General. Alger Hiss was a rising star in the State Department and director of the Office of Special Political Affairs. He was never far from center stage. After allegations were made of his communist activities, he appeared before the House Un-American Activities Committee.
I am not, and never have been, a member of the Communist Party.
Throughout 2 famous trials and a conviction for perjury, he has steadfastly proclaimed his innocence. And today there is a strong lobby in the United States to overturn his convictions.
Things Mr. Chambers charged, except that I knew him briefly.
Were you ever a communist?
No.
This man's memory is rather different. Nathaniel Weil was a member of the same Communist Party cell as Alger Hiss.
I asked you if you ever met Alger Hiss.
Oh, yes, about 30 times or so, 30 or 40.
Under what circumstances?
Well, I'm speaking about, the cell met every week. And attendance was a duty to be taken very seriously. You had to have an extremely good excuse for not being there. So that if one assumes that I was in this unit for 9 months, and that there was a meeting every week. It works out to about 30 or 40 times.
But Hader Massing, trying to recruit Noel Field, had no idea that Alger Hiss was also working for the Soviets. Each of the communist cells were small and carefully separated. In this case, both Alger Hiss and Hader Massing were trying to recruit the same man.
I met Alger Hiss because Noel called me a week after I'd been there in New York and said, "Can you come to Washington? I have a dinner date for you and Alger Hiss at my house." And I said, "Of course I'll come." And I came, and I met him. And the beginning was that he said, "So you are the girl that is trying to take Noel away from me." And I said, "Well, you are the man who is trying to take Noel away from me." And then I said, "I suppose, I don't know the exact words, don't forget, after all, I'm female and I'm a fighter, and I won't let that happen so easily." And he grinned, and then we had all sorts of conversations. We stood alone, he and I, at the window and spoke, and the farewell was that I said, or he said, and I don't remember who said what, but I think he said, "Whoever gets Noel, after all, we are working for the same boss."
More than 90% communist agents are blackmailed. These people are not ideological supporters, but they are brutally blackmailed.
Was this what you looked for when you were in the Czech intelligence?
Yeah,
the ability to blackmail people?
That's right, yeah.
Like that you were forcibly trapped. And we know the way that you were trapped, it was a homosexual entrapment, that you were entrapped, in which the Czechs got you. This is correct, right?
This man was blackmailed while on embassy duty in Prague, Czechoslovakia. As an Air Force cipher clerk, he was in a position to seriously compromise NATO readiness secrets.
It was a stupid thing to do, and I did it. I got caught doing it by somebody that shouldn't have, or shouldn't have. I've gone through this rigmarole for over a year after we left Prague. I haven't heard from anybody since that time.
Most Americans are very naive, politically very naive. And so I think it's, in many cases, very easy for communist intelligence officers to get in touch with important Americans, to seduce them in one way or another, and later to blackmail them.
I was not contacted in Czechoslovakia until about a month or two before I ever left the country.
When you say contacted, you're contacted
by the Czechs.
By the Czech intelligence service.
Well, I don't know who they were. I'm just saying I was contacted.
Yeah.
You know, I assumed that they had to be there.
What do you mean when you say contacted? What form did that contact take?
It was just a meeting on the street.
Of a man just walked up to you? And what did this man say?
Well, he indicated that they had had photographs of me, and you know, that he would contact me at some future date.
Well, can you tell me, what did the Czech intelligence service ask you for or want you to do?
There was no discussion at all. It was just the fact they confronted me with the fact that they had pictures and photographs of me doing this homosexual act with the other individuals in Prague. That was the whole extent of it. There was nothing asked for or given.
When you say the fellow that was involved in the situation?
In
the photographs?
Yeah.
Yeah. He was the other man with whom you were having this affair with.
Right.
And he defected, and as a result, that was how they found out about you. Right. And you were never asked for secret documents? There was just a man that came up to you in the street in Prague and said that we have photographs of you and we're going to ask you for something
at a later date.
At a later date.
It was never indicated what they wanted or how often or how soon or whatever.
What kind of information could you have theoretically given them?
God knows. God knows.
In Moscow, the KGB targets not only low-ranking officials, sometimes their blackmail extends right to the top. John Watkins was the Canadian ambassador to the Soviet Union in the late 50s when he was targeted for recruitment. Two KGB defectors, Nosenko and Golitsyn, have revealed that Watkins was under KGB control, but the story has never before received official confirmation. William Kelly is the former head of the RCMP Security Service.
They knew he was a homosexual. He knew that they knew he was a homosexual.
Well, are you saying that he was being blackmailed by them?
In a kind of a way, yes. That he knew that they could embarrass him if he didn't cooperate.
While in the Soviet Union, Lester B. Pearson, later to become Canadian Prime Minister, and John Watkins met with Khrushchev at his dacha on the Crimean Sea. The meetings were arranged by the Soviets to increase Watkins' prestige in Pearson's eyes and to speed his promotion to positions with access to sensitive information.
When you find that a man like Watkins, an ambassador, was a homosexual, and you knew the pressure that was being placed on homosexuals in Russia at that time, he was an obvious target for KGB, and he was surrounded by the KGB.
Watkins' handler was Anatoly Gorsky, alias Professor Nikitin, who had controlled the Soviet agents Philby, McLean, Burgess, and Blunt in Britain. Soon after Pearson's visit, Watkins was transferred back to Ottawa as Assistant Undersecretary of External Affairs. External Affairs chairs the committee that controls all of Canadian intelligence matters. He died of a heart attack on October 10, 1964, in Montreal, after being interrogated by the RCMP. For over 10 years, Tom Fox was head of U.S. military counterintelligence in charge of breaking major Soviet operations in America and Europe.
Well, the Soviets are like any good headhunting business organization that's looking for good talent. The Soviets will establish a relationship with the individual, determine the individual's needs, desires, strengths, and weaknesses, and try to exploit that.
David Barnett was a former employee with the CIA whose business was facing bankruptcy. His solution was to approach the KGB. In exchange for money, he compromised several CIA operations and the lives of the agents involved. He was instructed by the Soviets to obtain positions with several congressional intelligence committees in order to pass on inside information. For his services, he received $92,000. But the Soviets used subtler methods for recruiting. At the time when he was a congressional assistant with access to U.S. naval readiness secrets, Jim Kappas was approached by a Soviet official offering him the opportunity to write articles for a leading Soviet press agency.
I, as a staff member, had access to most of the classified materials that might have been presented to the committee from time to time.
How were the approaches first made?
Initially, it was strictly social. Later, of course, the meetings were arranged. They were arranged for just the two of us. They were arranged at primarily at bars.
What exactly did he suggest you should do in the beginning?
He suggested that I write articles for him, theoretically to be translated and published in the Novosti Press, which is a Soviet press service. Of course, later it became more obvious that the type of stories that he was seeking were those that were based on classified information or information that was not generally known to the public.
In attempting to recruit agents, the KGB also uses the services of the International Information Department, which controls TASS, Pravda, Izvestia, and the Novosti Press Agency. A man who is familiar with the procedures of recruitment is Yuri Bezmenov, who served with Novosti in India before defecting to the West.
Because during my 12 years with Novosti, it was quite clear to me that about 70 to 80, it's hard to count, % of the Novosti employees are at the same time either full-time officers of the KGB or part-time co-opted agents like myself when I was working for the Novosti.
For Soviets like Yuri Bezmenov or Carlo Tuomi, an illegal sent to America to recruit agents, The methods of recruitment are deceptively easy.
You recruit them by establishing a friendship, but you don't recruit them as a Soviet spy. You're supposedly working for some corporation which is interested in the trade secrets of a competing corporation. Or maybe you're asking information on behalf of a friend who's writing a technical book.
Was this what you were told in Moscow, that you should not say that you're working for the Soviets, that you should work for a company or...
Right. You come out as a Soviet intelligence agent only when you recruit the person on ideological basis.
In the 1930s, no one was more successful in recruiting young Americans than Haida Massing. She recruited at the highest levels of government and discovered that the ideological approach worked best with the privileged in America.
It would be almost impossible to recruit the working class. Almost impossible.
Of America?
Yeah. But it would be easy to recruit the intellectual and middle class.
But what does the Communist Party have to offer the elite?
Great ideas. The freedom of all time. Marxism. A different economical system. Thoughts. New medical experiments. The world. You see, the Soviet Union has never changed its goal. Never. You know, its goal as a phrase. It still wants to dominate the world. You know that. It has never changed that.
In the late 1950s, when Fidel Castro was taking his revolution out of the mountains toward the ultimate victory of Havana, the world watched what was believed to be a popular uprising of the people.
There is not communism or Marxism in our ideas. Our political philosophy is representative democracy and social justice in a well-planned economy.
But the revolution provided a new base for the KGB and the communist intelligence networks. Ladislav Bittman was a deputy director with Czech intelligence.
Years after the revolution, the Czechs helped to build up the Cuban intelligence service. And then, I think in the early 1960s, the Soviets took over completely when Cuba was really in the hands of the Soviet bloc, the Soviet Union.
Here at the Cuban mission to the United Nations in New York City, where 98 Cuban nationals work, at least half are members of the DGI, the Cuban Intelligence Service. This man is Nestor Garcia. Until the summer of 1980, he was officially listed as the first secretary to the Cuban mission. But in reality, he was chief of station for Cuban intelligence in New York City. In Moscow, the direct responsibility for running Cuban intelligence is assigned to Department 11 of the KGB, the same department that controls the Czechs, Poles, and other European communist intelligence agencies. Since the late 1960s, Soviet KGB officers living in Havana have directly run the operation of Cuban intelligence. As a result of 2 years' research, the Connections team has been able to ascertain these startling facts. Cuban intelligence was taken over by the Soviets in 1969. At that time, it became and has remained totally financed and controlled by the KGB. Now living in hiding, this man is the highest-ranking Cuban officer to defect to the United States. This is the first known television interview that a DGI officer has given.
In Moscow, I was trained in recruiting of agents, in infiltrating the CIA, in counterintelligence.
Was all your training directed at the United States? All your training in Moscow directed at the United States?
Even if the work dealt with operations in Italy, France, England, Canada. It was ultimately directed against the United States. In the case of a plan of sabotage against an American embassy, the physical layout of the plant had to be known.
Was there any other installations than embassies that were looked at for sabotage?
Sí, todas las grandes compañías. All the big American companies.
Since the late 1960s, General Semenov of the KGB has controlled the DGI from Havana for the Soviets.
General Simonov, the Soviet chief, would be the one who would give the order.
So the Russians controlled Cuban intelligence, actually controlled?
Totally and absolutely.
The second most important base of Cuban intelligence in North America is the Cuban consulate in Montreal. From here and other Cuban diplomatic missions, the DGI conducts intelligence and espionage operations through a spy network designed to increase the KGB's penetration of North American life.
You saw the files of these people in Havana, correct?
Yo conozco muchos. Yes, I know many.
Were they working, for instance, trying to get defense secrets from America?
Definitivamente. Yes, definitely, sir.
What else?
¿Qué otra cosa? Información política. Political information, economic information, leftist movements in the United States, on the blacks. Información sobre las plantas de industrial plants of the United States, like power plants and so on and so forth.
Why would they be interested in power plants?
This information is necessary to the Soviets.
This former DGI officer was shown the official list of the 12 Cubans stationed in Washington at the Cuban Interest Section.
How many on that list do you know as being in intelligence?
Four.
There are 4 on that list.
Certain.
Have you ever heard of a Mr. Ricardo Escartin?
He's an intelligence officer.
How about Mr. Juan Carbonell?
Juan Carbonell es otro oficial de inteligencia. Juan Carbonell is another intelligence officer who was in Jamaica.
Jeju Arbalea?
También. Also.
Mr. Martinez?
Sí, ese es otro oficial de inteligencia. Yes, this is another officer of the DGI.
6 months after this interview, Ricardo Escartin was expelled from the U.S. for espionage activities. But the other DGI officers, Carbonell, Arbolea, and Martinez, are still operating in Washington. In the mid-1960s, the black ghettos of America erupted in flames and violence in an apparently spontaneous protest. The riots did not need instigation by outside elements, yet once the conditions were ripe, revolutionaries of the left moved in, funded and supported by the Cuban DGI. One such revolutionary was Philip Luce.
What was the nature of your meeting with Fidel Castro?
Our nature, first of all, was we met a number of times, but our first meeting dealt with what the group would do in Cuba. Secondly was what we could do in the United States once we returned. And third of all, we received over $20,000 to bring back to the United States. The next year, we were engaged in tremendous riots in New York City, which then spread to Cleveland, to Los Angeles, to other areas. Agitation at that juncture was vital, not only to our cause, but to the cause of the Cubans. We trained people in the use of weapons. We also trained people on how to stand on top of their tenement buildings and throw down garbage cans filled with bricks. We also taught them how to make Molotov cocktails. As a matter of fact, the Cubans at that time said to us, "Your revolution is your own revolution." But while we were in Cuba, they gave us money to bring back to the United States to be utilized in terrorist activities. They also invited us to the embassy, wherein they gave us money to send young Americans to Cuba who were later trained in terrorist activities. We went to the Cuban embassy on a number of occasions to get funding.
In the 1960s, Bernardine Dorn was one of the leaders of the violent radical group known as the Weathermen. On December 3, 1980, in Chicago, Bernardine Dorn surrendered after 10 years in hiding. With her was another weatherman, Bill Ayers, with whom she had been living. They held a press conference and stated their continued commitment to radical change.
Resistance by every means necessary is happening and will continue to happen within the United States as well as around the world, and I remain committed to the struggle ahead.
The man with Bernardine Dorn, Bill Ayers, was one of the key members of the Weathermen during the 1960s. A man who knew Ayers well during those years was Larry Grathwohl, a former member of the Weather Underground, which had developed close ties with the Cubans.
Well, when the Cubans viewed the revolutionary struggle in the United States, they recognized the fact that the left as it existed in 69 and 70 was not capable of overthrowing the government by itself. Consequently, they had hoped that the group itself would be able to attack the system from within and provide assistance to the international movement, the international communist revolution. As a weatherman, if I became cut off from the main body of the organization, the Weather Underground organization, I could make contact or reestablish contact by going to the Cuban embassy in Mexico or Canada and asking to, as an example, I wanted to get in touch with Bernardine Delgado. That was the code word, Delgado. And I would tell them that I'm Larry Delgado and I can be reached at such and such a phone number or at such and such an address, and the Cubans would make the connection and put me back in contact with the
How do you know this?
I don't
How do you know this information?
Bill Ayers gave me those instructions in, it was either February or March of 1970 in Detroit.
The Cuban DGI is organized into 7 departments and subdivided into geographic sections, the largest one being the United States section. It controls North American operations, including the UN, diplomatic posts, and radical groups. During the 1970s, hundreds of young Americans circumvented U.S. travel regulations to go to Cuba to harvest sugarcane and experience the Cuban Revolution firsthand. As a cover for the recruitment of the Weathermen, the DGI organized the Venceremos Brigades. The organizers, tour guides, and hosts were officers of the DGI who used the occasion to train young American radicals. Cuban intelligence was well prepared for the Venceremos Brigades when they arrived.
Every time that a Venceremos Brigade contingent arrived in Cuba, all the operational of the DGI had to drop what they were doing and go to work on the Venceremos Brigade. We had to investigate, collect background to see who could be recruited, what information could be obtained.
Do you know of young Americans who were recruited in the brigade to work for the Cuban intelligence who came back to America and were secretly working for the Cubans?
Yes, and they are still working.
Still working for the Cubans in America?
Yes, definitely.
The brigade was established with the sole purpose of providing a cover for the Weathermen to get their people to Cuba for training. And that's why it existed. As a matter of fact, when our people came back off the 1st Venceremos Brigade, and I think it was February of 1970, the